Hello, everyone. I am Durin Jove, and this is my new podcast, the SJW podcast by Durin Jove, in which I talk about political issues that I feel are distorted or underrepresented. I am actually very nervous about starting this podcast. It took me some time to actually get the nerve, and to please leave any thoughtful comments or criticisms on how I can improve this podcast, or any political questions that you may have for me pertaining to any subject matter that I talk about, in my email, jovejarin@hotmail.com. So, for the purposes of today's podcast, I will be talking about how the establishment media, for lack of a better word, has either misrepresented or distorted the black community in the United States of America, and how this influences ongoing systemic racism against the black community within the United States. Both politicians and the national news media have lied about there being more black men in prison than in college, and seem to emphasize single black mothers as a huge problem over white single families and Hispanic single families. And I think overall this misinformation tries to portray black Americans as some sort of criminal class, which is completely unjustified, especially when someone takes the time to look into the hard evidence of crime rates. Now, regarding the lie about there being more black men in prison than in college, the original study by the Justice Department failed to take into account vocational colleges and traditionally black colleges in which the population is demographically more black than any other ethnic group. So, in short, the original analysis would only be true if you ignore vocational schools and traditionally black universities. There is also overemphasis on black mothers being single parents. While it is true that over 60% of black Americans live in single families throughout the country, this is not unique. There seems to be an attempt to say this is some sort of special issue within the black community, but if you look at the hard numbers, it's around 6.5 million black families that live under single parents, and 6 to 7 million single parents for Hispanic communities, which for Hispanic communities accounts for 40% of the Hispanic American population, and for white families, 9 million single parents, which accounts for 25% of the population of white Americans. Now, I don't think we should disparage any ethnic group for this issue at all. I don't think it's fair to anyone, and I don't think we should tie ourselves to traditional family values, which has not, in fact, anything to do with reducing crime at all. The much touted Asian community has approximately 16 to 17%, and that accounts for about 500,000 families across the country. But what this speaks to, if you even consider it an issue, is a problem with American culture that is affecting all American families, regardless of ethnic background. And I think the emphasis on ethnic background really does distort whatever the issue is, if you even consider this an issue. I personally don't. I don't think it should be considered one. If someone is comfortable raising their children all alone, then I don't think it is any of my business, rather, to tell them how to live their lives, regardless of whatever ethnic background they happen to be. I think it's just a way to disparage people of their own personal lives. Whether it was choice or not, this is just insulting people for living their own lives, in my view, on the clothing and music discrimination towards Black Americans. I think this is, in fact, a fundamental assault upon First Amendment rights, because the argument is if they didn't wear certain clothing or listen to certain music, then they wouldn't be dead. Is this really the attitude that we're tolerating for alleged victims of police violence? Because if so, then we are treating Black Americans as second-class citizens, because we are limiting their choices to literally determine whether it was okay that they died. I am not comfortable with that type of rhetoric. I don't think anyone should be. And that type of rhetoric really serves to ignore police abuses, such as in Baltimore, which led to the Baltimore Riots. Now, while national news covered riots and gave a very favorable depiction to the Baltimore police, internally, according from police unions, they are actually seen as the pariahs of police departments because of the high number of abuses that have plagued Baltimore police throughout their history. In fact, local governments in Baltimore had to pay approximately $5.7 million yearly to victims of police brutality. Baltimore Sun offers extensive coverage on these violations of ordinary citizens' rights and some of the victims' physical injuries suffered. And the data has payouts going back from at least 2007. The people of Baltimore were asking for reforms, protesting for them, for at least that long, but nothing was done. The article claims that there has been progress in reforms with the new police commissioner, but I have to maintain my skepticism because part of the settlement agreement was that the victims of police brutality could not go public or make public statements to news agencies about these cases and about what happened to them. Otherwise, they would be sued for the amount of money they were paid for by the settlement, and perhaps even more than that, depending on the case-by-case basis. Victims were prohibited from speaking of any facts, allegations about the incident that triggered the settlement, so they were not allowed to speak about what happened to them. And the Baltimore Sun reports that most of the people who did come forward for this particular article, called Undue Force, live in fear of police retaliation for speaking out against them. That is why the Baltimore riots happened, not because of music or what clothes they wore, since the victims happened to be disproportionately Black American citizens. And this leads into another issue. During the riots, many people in the news media itself, and generally throughout social media, said black on black crime is the highest rate. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not a unique crime statistic. Black on black crime is the highest rate of crime for Black Americans. Yes. White on white crime is the highest crime rate against white Americans. Hispanic on Hispanic crime is the highest against Hispanic citizens. And that is true for Asian on Asian crime. And more broadly, it is people of the same ethnic background as you that are more likely to rob, rape, or murder you in the United States. This is not unique to Black Americans. The only ethnic group in which this is untrue are Native Americans, because they are more likely to be robbed, raped, or murdered by someone of a different ethnic background than them. For reasons I'll get into in a future podcast, the Bureau of Justice statistics from 2008 and the FBI's Uniform Crime Reports from 2010 both show this. So what we have here is crime information that is selectively chosen and distorted to present a deeply negative and I would say offensive portrayal of Black American citizens in this country as some sort of criminal class, which I find to be completely disgraceful and disgusting. But it is easy for the media to do this by portraying buildings being burned down or people rioting on the streets to strike an emotional chord and to make people feel fear and panic, instead of looking at the real causes and speaking of how victims' First Amendment rights are in all seriousness being infringed upon by local governments, such as in Baltimore. And the national news media does know that this is going to have an emotional impact on ordinary American citizens who watch these violent protests happening. In fact, we have a history of it, the super predator stereotype, which I think defend racially insensitive comments as somehow legitimate when they're completely false. And sadly, it may even make some Black Americans within the United States feel as if it is somehow true deep down. I've had some friends and acquaintances who've told me that some Black Americans who they've spoken to, who they personally know, feel that they as a community do it to themselves. And this is completely false. And this sort of internalized shaming is the result of racism permeating throughout American culture and being given far too permissive of an atmosphere based upon false facts and indifference to racist hecklers. Now, a growing problem that has shown a systemic level of racism is the temp industry, selectively omitting Black applicants from certain positions like administrative assistants. In this particular case of administrative assistants, temp industries generally want white, thin women in their 20s, and they need to be unmarried. For many blue-collar jobs, the general consensus is that when the person requesting a job hires the temp organization, they want a particular kind of person, typically either white Americans or Hispanic Americans, but very few want Black Americans for specific types of jobs. Now, in fact, the temp industry, at least the ones that have released information, generally do have a largely Black American workforce, slightly above 50%, I believe. But the problem is they've been selectively omitted, for lack of a better term, from certain jobs because of their ethnic background. It's because, generally speaking, the hirees who come to the temp industries in these want either white Americans or Hispanic Americans to be the ones getting the jobs. And the racism has been coded among the temp agencies that are doing this. To quote the article by revealnews.org, New Jersey, blacks were called number twos. In Illinois, code 3 meant Latino worker. A Texas temp agency called whites blue eyes. An Ohio agency called them vanilla cupcakes, hockey players, or someone like you and me. An agency owner in Alabama was accused of running her finger along her own white skin cheek to indicate a preference for whites. In Seattle, no Mohammeds meant not to send anyone of Arab descent. In Florida, construction contractors said, "Don't send me any monkeys," meaning black. In Texas, bilingual often meant a request for Latinos in jobs where speaking more than one language wasn't necessary. It is a problem throughout the country, unfortunately. Now, provided that there is a description box for the website or application that you're listening to this from, I will be providing the news articles that I have used. For the most part, they're from government or national news organizations themselves, meaning they have all this information, but they're still choosing to have this terribly discriminatory image presented of Black Americans and Black American culture. And part of the reason I'm doing this is that I really could not understand why they would always depict in this manner, despite knowing that the information was wrong. This is all public information. It's not secret. They should already know everything that I've just mentioned, but they seem to distort the information or appeal to fear and paranoia to create this ridiculous racial divide. With that being said, I would like to mention that nothing I said was meant to disparage any American citizen of any ethnic background or to be disparaging of the police force across the country. I have criticism of the Baltimore police based upon Baltimore Sun's investigation on what was condoned and ignored regarding the Baltimore police, but that does not reflect police agencies across the United States. And I have nothing but the utmost respect for officers in uniform. It should not be interpreted as a way to denigrate the police, because it is not. I am making this podcast to talk about social issues that I feel are underrepresented or distorted to give a disingenuous picture of ongoing social and political issues. If you like this podcast or have criticisms of this podcast, then please send any questions, comments, and criticisms to my email at jovejirin@hotmail.com. I am in fact very nervous about making this podcast, and I would like to know if you, the listener, really do have any comments or criticisms. Greatly appreciate it. That is, I would greatly appreciate being sent comments and criticisms. Thank you for listening.